Clashes in Admiralty as masked men try to remove barricades. Police remove some barriers in Central and Wan Chai without incident. And new barricades set up by occupiers in Mongkok.
Good evening. It's been 16 days since the Occupy movement began. Protesters are still gathered in Admiralty, Causeway Bay and Mongkok. And student leaders tonight insist people won't disperse until the government responds to their demands. Several sections of roads have been reopened to traffic, though, as the police peacefully remove some of the barriers set up by protesters in Central and Wan Chai early this morning. The clashes broke out in the afternoon as groups of people tried to break through the protesters' barricades at the core rally zone in Admiralty.
Groups of masked men were spotted gathering on the roadside of Queensway near Lippo Centre at around 1 p.m. About half an hour later, they started charging towards the protesters. Some were carrying knives and other sharp tools. They cut the plastic ties that kept the barricades together. It took a number of police officers to keep the situation under control. More men arrived and started to fight with the protesters who were trying to hold the fort. The police arrested 3 men aged between 18 and 47 for common assault and possession of offensive weapons. At around the same time, a number of taxi drivers drove their vehicles up to the same barricaded area and made themselves heard. Large groups of people also showed up, demanding that the Occupy protesters open up the roads. It became a heated exchange as police officers called for the anti-Occupy demonstrators to control their emotions. But more people turned up to try to get the occupiers off the roads. Police formed a human chain to separate the two sides, raising a sign warning people not to cross the police cordon. Officers later opened up a passage for the anti-Occupy protesters to leave. On the other side of Queensway, near the Justice Drive flyover, 2 trucks arrived to remove the barricades and other obstacles set up on the road. The protesters stopped the trucks and demanded the drivers get out. Officers rushed to the scene and separated the 2 groups. The police reminded protesters they're illegally occupying roads.
Many of the roads in Hong Kong has been unlawfully occupied for days, for over 2 weeks already, and the normal lives of the general public has been seriously affected, resulting in much social grievances and many confrontations has occurred, causing injuries to both citizens and police.
Hui also warned protesters against reinforcing existing obstacles or setting up new ones, saying the police will collect evidence to determine if there's been any breach of the law. Alex Chow, Secretary General of the Federation of Students, tonight condemned the use of violence against peaceful protesters. He suspects the attacks were premeditated and coordinated. He also criticized the government for refusing the demonstrators' request to open up the area in front of the east wing of the central government offices for them to move their protest off the roads.
Motorists can now access certain roads that have been blocked by Occupy protesters. Police this morning removed some barricades from Central, Admiralty and Mongkok, and the police said today they will move in to remove obstacles in Queensway in Admiralty and Yewall Street and Causeway Bay, but they stopped short of saying when. Police stressed they were not trying to disperse Occupy protesters. Stephanie Choi reports.
The government explained this afternoon why it decided earlier today to turn down the Occupy advocates' request to reopen the central government office's East Wing forecourt.
The forecourt has its functions to fulfill as a vehicular circulation point, as well as a drop-off and pick-up point. That is why the protesters, by seeking to move their occupation points into forecourt, is in fact another kind of occupation that would paralyze the operation of the central government offices.
Early this morning, police officers removed barricades and water-filled barriers from Connaught Road Central and the Garden Road flyover. Meanwhile, officers in riot gear removed metal barricades and water-filled barriers from Cotton Tree Drive. One officer assured demonstrators that they were only retrieving government property and removing obstacles, not dispersing protesters. Dozens of demonstrators rushed to Gloucester Road to confront the police officers who were removing barricades outside the Academy for Performing Arts. They formed a line of defence using tents and supplies. Motorists can now access Fenwick Pier Street, Devoe Road Central outside the old Legislative Council building, and Chater Road. This truck driver said he's been stuck in traffic for 45 minutes each day over the past 2 weeks, but today that has dropped to 15 minutes. But the junction between Long War Road and Tim Hwa Avenue remains inaccessible as demonstrators stopped government officials from entering the central government offices this morning. Police also attempted to clear barricades set up by protesters on Mongkok Road in Kowloon, but demonstrators prevented them from doing so. The occupiers reinforced the barricades on nearby streets. The junction of Argyle Street and Portland Street outside Langham Place has been reopened after the barricades there were removed early this morning. The police said this afternoon obstacles on Queensway in Admiralty and Ewa Street in Causeway Bay will be removed without giving a timetable. Stephanie Choi, TVB News.
Chief Executive Leung Chun-ying, who was in Guangzhou earlier today to attend the Pan-Pearl River Delta Forum, has voiced his support for the police to remove some of the barricades. Liz Yoon reports.
Chief Executive Leung Chun-ying gave reassurance that the police will be using minimal force when dealing with protesters whom he says have seriously disrupted social order and security. In certain areas, there are barricades and objects obstructing the roads, but not many people are occupying those sites, he said. Under such circumstances, the police will remove the objects. Yesterday, four leading journalist organizations, including the Hong Kong Journalists Association, demanded that the chief executive meet with the local and international media immediately to address pressing issues. In response to the call, Leung said he was busy lately, but he welcomes any questions from the press and he relies on the media to disseminate messages to the public. The CE reiterated that he would not step down, stressing that anyone who leads the SAR in its political reform would have to stick to the constitutional and legal framework. Former Financial Secretary Anthony Leung said he understands and sympathizes with protesters. But the Occupy movement, now in its third week, affects the livelihood of the general public, and he believes it is losing people's support. Liz Yun, TVB News.
LegCo President Zhang Yuk-sing said today the legislature will hold meetings as scheduled this week, but with protesters occupying road access to the LegCo complex. Zhang said authorities are still trying to figure out a way to ensure the safety of officials and lawmakers on their way to and from the meetings.
When we have a crowd which is loaded with emotion because of the nature of the debate, and we have government officials and members of the council from various parties having to go through the crowds themselves, then there is a very high risk of a commotion or disorder.
To minimize the risks, Zhang said authorities are communicating with protesters to allow vehicular access to the complex. This, as the first full council meeting, will be held on Wednesday after the summer break, following last week's postponement due to security concerns. LegCo staff are also coordinating with the police on safety measures, and only 10 people will be let into the public gallery.
Still to come tonight in the broadcast, parts of India and Japan lashed by stormy weather. The government's columbarium policy under fire from the Ombudsman. And in South Africa, Oscar Pistorius to be sentenced later this week.
The HKFA Centennial Celebration match, Hong Kong versus Argentina, live Tuesday night at 7:55 on Pearl.
喂，阿仔啊，我頭好痛啊，仲鼻塞添啊！你等下。喂，老婆。喉嚨好痛啊，仲周身骨痛。我發燒啊，你摸下我頭幾興。我沾到鼻水啦，我咳死
幸福為你行多步，特強幸福傷風咳嗽，12大傷風感冒同咳症狀，一次過 KO。幸福為你行多步。
喺我有第二胎嘅時候，返到屋企以為自己冇事，當時我好擔心肚裏邊個 BB， 我老公即刻打俾 Louis， 佢好清楚我個 plan， 佢叫我哋放心，醫生建議嘅治療都 cover 到㗎。我好珍惜今日有嘅一切。
英國寶城用心聆聽，更知你心。
The time now is 7:41. The time check was brought to you by Seiko.
Welcome back. At least 8 people are dead in India as a powerful storm blasted the country's eastern seaboard. At its peak Sunday, Cyclone Hudhud was packing winds of close to 200 kilometers per hour. Trees were uprooted, power lines downed, and buildings damaged. Most people heeded warnings to take shelter, but some people were killed by falling trees and masonry. Today, residents in the area face a lack of food and fuel. Thousands of homes were damaged. After passing through Andhra Pradesh, the cyclone hit the adjoining state of Odisha, but with much less intensity. Typhoon Vongfong has slammed into Japan's southern islands of Kyushu and Shikoku and is set to bear down on the main island, Honshu. The strongest storm to hit Japan this year is threatening torrential rain, floods, and even tornadoes. Almost 500,000 people have been evacuated, with dozens hurt. The wind speeds have weakened since Saturday's peak of 234 kilometers per hour, which qualified Vongfong as a super typhoon. Thousands of travelers have been stranded at airports, and more than 500 flights have been canceled.
South Korea is warning North Korea of a strong response if it provokes an incident similar to one last week that sparked an exchange of machine gun fire across the border. Despite the warning, South Korean President Park Geun-hye repeated her commitment to engage with the North, saying the door is always open to dialogue. The exchange of fire last Friday began after the North fired shots at balloons carrying leaflets sent towards the inter-Korean border by activists in the South who are critical of the Pyongyang leadership. North Korea said the leaflets constituted a provocation and threatened to respond with force. Last Saturday, Pyongyang said planned talks with the South to try to improve ties were in danger of being cancelled because of the leaflets.
A top U.S. healthcare official blames a breach of protocol for the infection of a nurse in Dallas who was caring for an Ebola patient who died last week. Dr. Thomas Friedman, director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, said the nurse's fellow workers are being monitored, and he warned more cases of infection are possible. Alan Buknia reports.
Teams of hazardous materials workers cleaned the apartment complex of the healthcare worker Sunday. She's the first known case of the disease being contracted or transmitted in America, even though she wore full protective gear while caring for a patient who later died from the virus. It's not immediately clear if the hospital prepared its staff with simulation drills before admitting the patient, Thomas Eric Duncan, who traveled from Liberia to visit his family. A national survey of American nurses, however, suggests few